Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's event. My name is Jörg Bergstermann from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and as you probably all know, we have a long-standing cooperation with Egyenlőség on political, economic, and social issues in different series. This year we have started a new series on the political economy of Hungary within the European context. And the idea is basically to try to look a bit ahead, really to put current developments into a wider context and look a little bit ahead. And we would always try in this series, particularly always try to do this with like very reputable academics, VIP academics, if you so wish. And this makes me even more happy because today we have here the inventor of the term, the much used term of the dependent market economy or dependent capitalism. Sometimes also referred to as FDI dependent capitalism, because that's what it usually boils down to, the large dependency on foreign direct investment. What does it do to an economy? Where does Hungary stand also compared to its neighbors and peers? I believe this couldn't be more timely because we did have debates along these lines during past years, and we all know about the mega trends and that something is changing in the economies, not only in this region and not only in Europe, but I think Corona actually sped up a few developments and a few insights as well. So this will make it even more interesting. As usual in our series, Zoltán Pogátsa will guide us through, and our guest is Professor Andreas Nölke. Zoltán will introduce him a bit more, I suppose. Thank you very much for attending. I'm sure it's going to be extremely interesting.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for the introduction. My name is Zoltán Pogátsa. I'm the editor-in-chief of the New Equality magazine, online magazine for social theory. We are very grateful for the long-running cooperation between Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and ourselves in organizing these events. Jörg has already introduced our keynote speaker, our VIP academic today, Andreas Nölke from Goethe Universitat Frankfurt. Thank you very much, Andreas, for having accepted to come to talk to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Our Hungarian discussant will be Professor Zoltán Gál from the University of Pécs. Thank you, Zoltán, also for accepting to talk to us today. Without wasting more time, I would like to jump into the actual discussion itself. Now, what we agreed on with Professor Nölke is that at the beginning, he would describe to us this entire issue of varieties of capitalism and the actual model of FDI dependent or dependent market economy. The reason why we thought this would be interesting and important for a Hungarian audience or a Central Eastern European audience is that we had the feeling that most everyday discussions are still taking place in terms of the dichotomy of capitalism versus communism. So the 40 years or 70 years of communism that took place in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, left such an impression on people that they were always looking at the other side of the Iron Curtain, looking at capitalism there. There was a transition from communism to capitalism. Then most people still stick to this dichotomy, and they discuss the world in terms of the dichotomy. But academic literature has gone far beyond that. And we have this thing called the Varieties of Capitalism Research Program. And Andreas, as Jörg has already mentioned in his introduction, Andreas is the VIP because he is credited with having invented the term which describes this Central Eastern European new model, new variety of capitalism. So can we please start with you telling us what the varieties of capitalism literature is and how you came up with this, why you were interested in this region, and how you came up with this definition. Andreas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zoltán, for the very kind introduction. And let me share my screen with you. Oops, yes, it should be okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I had the pleasure to invent this term together with a Dutch PhD student at that time. And let me first explain the background of the whole intellectual enterprise, because I think this is very important. The whole, let's say, discipline or the whole school that I'm coming from is called comparative capitalism. It's a bit broader than the varieties of capitalism concept, but the latter is, of course, the most important and well-known. The basic idea is to compare capitalist systems on the national level. And the striking thing is that if you take a closer look at national economic systems, they're very different. For example, if you compare, which is a traditional comparison in the varieties of capitalism approach, Germany and the US, you will find out that, for example, in Germany, labor unions are extremely important and powerful. And we have a very specific system of training on the company level. If you go to the US, for example, labor unions are hardly important. Training takes place in other places. In the US, however, financial markets, for example, are very important. In the UK, financial markets are important. In Germany, again, financial markets are not important. So we have a strong degree of variety of national capitalist systems. And the idea of this academic enterprise is to single out some general models so that we don't have to discuss each country by country, but that we kind of say divide the world in 4, 5 different major types of capitalism. And we do so by a focus on comparative institutional advantage. So the argument is that certain models of capitalism lead to certain typical advantages. So the Germans, for example, have an advantage in machinery industry or luxury automobiles. The US has advantages in IT. And this is not by coincidence. There are certain institutional complementarities behind these institutional advantages. And the institutions we are looking at are corporate governance, how a company is governed, finance, where companies get their money from, industrial relations, which means the system between labor unions and companies, the education system, and the innovation system. Now, this normally works on a high level of abstraction. We try to group as many countries as possible to one type. So it really, in the original varieties of capitalism system, the whole world was put into 2 camps, coordinated and liberal capitalism. Then when we came up with the term of dependent capitalism, there was a third model. Now, I can tell that the invention of the term came from my first visit to Budapest, because when I was driving with a taxi from the airport to the city, I was struck by seeing so much commercial advertisements of German companies, some Austrian companies, but I was, of course, expecting lots of Hungarian companies, but I didn't see anyone. So I was really struck by this dominance of German and other Western European companies, and that triggered my interest into the economic system of countries like Budapest. Like Hungary, and it also stuck with me. There seems to be some kind of dependence on Western companies. Now, in a more general, more systematic way, in the years following years, this is something that is around some 15 years by now. We have looked into different types of capitalism in emerging economies. So my specialty is to look not, let's say, into German capitalism, although I like to do that as well, but rather into emerging economies and to identify those emerging economies that have particularly high rates of growth. And there are two groups of countries, two types of capitalism in emerging economies that have been very successful over the last 15, 20 years. The one is the so-called dependent capitalism in the Visegrad region, and the other one is a so-called state-permeated capitalism in countries like China and India. Let me very briefly explain the background of these terms and the focus of these models before I give you some figures on this development. If you look at the dependent capitalism in the Visegrad region, it has a comparative institutional advantage on semi-standardized industrial goods such as cars. However, these cars are not being fundamentally developed in the region, but rather the region harbors assembly platforms, it harbors production facilities for car parts, and so on. The core innovation remains in the headquarters, the parts of the companies where you also make a lot of profit by branding cars and so on. Very often this is, for example, in Germany, but of course not limited to Germany. In the Visegrad region, in the dependent market economies, the focus is rather on assembly because wages are lower, but people are very skilled. And of course, there are innovations, but not, let's say, the development of whole new cars and brands and so on. The problem is that the dominance of these foreign companies limits the ability for independent economic strategies. For example, you have to offer these companies good conditions to attract foreign direct investment. So you have to be careful with taxes, or you think you have to be careful with raising taxes. And that, of course, limits, for example, the money you can spend on education, training, science, and the like. If we very quickly, which is not the main purpose today of my talk, to state-permeated capitalism in China, in India, they have a very different model. Of course, they also attract a lot of foreign direct investment, but as you will see in a minute, it's very limited in the context of their economic models. The focus in these economies is clearly on domestic demand. Although we think that China is a major export power, and of course it's important, Chinese exports are important in many economies. If you take a look at the Chinese economy, it's absolutely not export dependent. It has a strong share of domestic consumption, and the domestic market is way more important for Chinese companies than exports. Second, what is very striking, very different from these countries to the dependent market economies is that the countries' governments, both in China, but also in India and other countries following this model, put a strong focus on national control over economic policy. So they are very worried about giving up control to foreign companies, and they want to be able to shape their own future, to invest in technologies, to use domestic demand for their own companies. Let me illustrate these very abstract ideas now with a few figures that are all taken from a publication which is openly available from a journal in Warsaw in Poland. The first is exactly the point of departure for our whole debate, the high volume of FDI in the Visegrad region. Here you see the stock of FDI in relationship to the size of the economy, and you see that the countries in the Visegrad region really stand out. If you compare this with India and China, on the other side, you see that FDI, although these countries are important destinations for FDI, is much less important there. And you can also see, for example, the case of Japan. Japan is also very careful with letting foreign companies in country. They want to keep control over their own economy, and therefore are very reluctant to allow FDI inward. The countries of the Visegrad region, in turn, are very open to FDI. They have about the lowest restrictions for FDI. This is an OECD measure for restrictions for foreign direct investment. And you see here that the Visegrad countries are among the most open countries in this regard. And the marked contrast is really to China and India, which are the most closed to FDI. So, of course, they allow FDI. They also attract a lot of FDI, but they only allow FDI according to their own rules. So you have to negotiate with the government, and you're only able to bring in FDI if you fulfill certain conditions, particularly technology transfer to domestic companies. And that's why the OECD considers these economies way more restrictive than the model of the Visegrad countries. So these are two very interesting comparative cases because they're both opened to the world economy roughly at the same time. They are also the two regions that have seen a very dynamic development in recent times, but the models they have chosen for integrating into global capitalism are completely different. Openness on the side of the Visegrad region, a very strategic, very selective opening on the side of China and India. The same you can see with regard to protectionism. This is again an OECD indicator that gives you an idea how open the markets are. And you see again in China and India that they are rather protectionist. They keep their markets rather closed in order to maximize domestic demand for their own companies. Whereas you can see in the Visegrad countries, they are as open as the other important Western economies. And therefore, of course, a lot of demand is being serviced by foreign companies. Another striking difference between these two types of emerging market capitalism is public control on the banking sector. The banking sector is very important if you want to control the fate of your economy, because if you have banks that are under public control, for example, like the German Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, you have the ability to say, okay, from the state, well, we want, for example, focus on investments for climate protection in the years to come, and then you can offer specific credit terms for this and so on. As you can see in the state-permeated capitalism in China and India, the most important banks are under state control. So credit allocation is being controlled by the state. If you go to the Visegrad countries, only in Poland, you see a certain degree of state-controlled banks. But otherwise, the banking sector is mainly in external hands, is led by foreign banks. Although these figures, I think, are a bit outdated, I think the situation has changed over the last 10 years a bit. The most, let's say, worrisome figures are my last figures. They relate to the expenditures for research and development. And here, of course, you can imagine that expenditures for research and development are maybe lower than in Germany, Japan, or the US, which are leaders globally in many fields of technology development. But also a country like China now has a much higher share of expenditures in relation to, let's say, the size of the economy than in the Visegrad region. And if I would have more recent figures, which is always a bit difficult with Chinese statistics, let's say the figures for China would even be higher. So this is something that is very worrisome because you're not able to develop your own technologies and your companies that have, let's say, the abilities like Chinese companies to become world leaders in technologies. So to wrap up with my presentation, the model of dependent capitalism has worked quite well in the past. If you look at GDP growth, for example, in Europe, the Visegrad region is doing an excellent job. Poland is, for example, the country with the highest growth rates over many years. If we look at distribution in country, it's a different story because, let's say, the fruits of this growth are being very unevenly distributed in the countries. I also think that the model will remain quite stable for the next 5 to 10 years. The countries will gain a lot from the next generation EU funds. I think that Germany will relocate additional car production to the region because Germany is phasing out combustion car production over the next years and will relocate part of this production to the region because German headquarters will rather focus on electric cars. And there will also be a tendency of nearshoring after the coronavirus pandemic, so that some, let's say, production facilities that currently are in East Asia may be relocated to Eastern Europe, maybe also to Southern Europe. So I think for the next years, this will remain stable. However, I'm quite worried about the long-term sustainability because this model is difficult to operate with rising wages. So you can either have strongly rising wages or keep these facilities. Otherwise, they will move farther eastward, let's say to Romania. But even more worrisome, you are very much dependent on the fate of the headquarters of these companies. I'm not too optimistic for the German car producers in the long run, and for the German export sector anyway. I think it has seen the, let's say, the highlight of its expansion globally. So you may be caught in this maybe this demise of the German export model. And finally, let me highlight you again to this article where we coined this this term. So if you want to read this in more systematic way, and also the more recent figures where I have that I have used during my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm very much looking forward to Zoltán and the debate.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Nölke. I think this was a very concise overview of the concept of varieties of capitalism and of dependent market economies. Before we go on with Professor Gál and turn more towards Hungary, I have two questions related to the model, which I would like to address to you, Andreas. One of them is, I would just like to highlight the importance of the fact, and I'd like to receive some confirmation from you if this is a correct view of seeing it, that this model of capitalism that you are discussing now, dependent market economy or FDI dependent market economy, is actually a new model of capitalism. So if you look at the varieties of capitalism literature and you analyze liberal market economies, or the Anglo-Saxon model as it's sometimes called, which characterizes the United States, for instance, that's one model. Then you have welfare states, or the continental model, which characterizes Western Europe. And then you have the Mediterranean model, which some people discuss, which is about small and medium-sized enterprises, which basically characterizes, obviously, the region from Spain to Turkey, much of the Mediterranean. That's another model. And then you have what you called state-permeated capitalism, or which in some of the literature, it's just called the Far Eastern development model, development state model, which obviously is about the Asian tiger economies, and nowadays China is another model. So you had these models prior to Central and Eastern Europe, basically transitioning from communism to capitalism. These models had existed. There wasn't much focus on it because most of the focus was on the dichotomy of capitalism and communism, but these models had existed before. And when Central and Eastern Europe transitioned to capitalism, we basically came up with a new model. Our capitalism, to put it very bluntly, our capitalism isn't like the capitalism of any other region in the world. So this is the one point that I'd like to highlight and ask confirmation from you if you agree with the assessment that basically we have to understand in the Visegrad region or in the Central Eastern European region that this capitalism that we have isn't like other forms of capitalism. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. This is completely unique. I think this is completely unique in the history of capitalism. And there's also a reason why this model of capitalism is so unique and why we don't find it anywhere else on the planet, both at the moment and in history. Because normally, this degree of dependency on foreign companies is not possible, because normally, even if you, for example, open up an economy like the Chinese one and so on, there are always, let's say, domestic capitalists that are imported and then will try to protect the economy, and they want to keep their degree of control and so on. Now, the interesting thing was really when the Visegrad countries opened up, they were extremely positive about capitalism and about foreign direct investment. They were really welcoming foreign companies, which to a degree that has never been the case anywhere on the planet and in the history of capitalism. And that explains why this region is so unique. There is nobody, I mean, the only state that maybe sometimes partially comes close to it maybe is Mexico, but also only northern Mexico, not even the whole Mexican economy. There's really, truly no region in the world that has this strong degree of foreign direct investment, this kind of openness, this degree of dependency on foreign companies. So it's truly unique.
Okay, thank you. I think that is very important to basically pin down right at the beginning that this is a unique form of capitalism. Now, the fact that we came up with a new model and this had not existed elsewhere doesn't mean that it cannot be successful. And indeed, you have called it successful. So in your presentation, you have referred to it as a successful model, which I am personally surprised about. And I think many people in the region would also be surprised that you think this model is successful. I looked at the GDP per capita statistics of this region long term. So you can do that. You can go to the Angus Medicine database, and this allows you to look at the position of these countries in the global economy in terms of GDP per capita. Now, what I saw there is that countries such as Czechoslovakia or Hungary were always a little bit above the global average. So we're not far off the global average, like Western Europe, which was always very high up above the global average, but we were always a little bit, considerably above the global average. Now, of course, there was a huge slump during transition. And if you look at our position today, we are basically back to that original position. So the long-term trend seems to be very strong. A country like Czech Republic now, Slovakia, an independent state, Hungary, Poland, we are once again back a little bit above the global average, but far, far away from Western Europe. So you don't have any country from this region which has basically caught up with Western Europe. And I think many people expected in this region a convergence, not to our original position, which we had during, for instance, the communist times or previously in the interwar period, but many people expected a convergence to Western Europe, which did not take place in any countries of the region. There were some countries which are more successful than others. For instance, Poland, you mentioned yourself, is probably the most successful country in the region, but Poland had a huge slump. So in the 1980s, Poland had an enormous decline, much bigger than either Czechoslovakia or Hungary. So their base was lower, and then they re-emerged as a strong power in the region. So probably in Poland, people would call this model successful. But I have personally been to conferences in Poland where they were discussing the middle income trap. And a lot of people in this region today are discussing the middle income trap, the notion that this region is actually caught in this trap of being a middle income country. Yes, you are successful in the sense that you're not the global periphery, but you're not successful in terms of not being able to move on and really converge with the center. My last words, and we can also contrast ourselves with the Far Eastern region. So you mentioned China, you mentioned some of these Far Eastern economies. And if you make that comparison, I think the economic success of the FDI-dependent model really diminishes. So you have, for instance, Singapore, which was far, far, far below the global average when it started off. South Korea was an extremely poor country. Taiwan, China was a desperately poor country in the 1970s. And all of these economies have at least converged to, I mean, China has converged to about the global average, but it's a huge achievement for such a big country. But South Korea or Singapore or Taiwan has really become first world. So as Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, has in his title of his memoirs, they went from third world to first world. So if you make that comparison, would you still say that the Central Eastern European FDI-dependent model is successful if you can make that transition, a much larger transition, with other models of capitalism? That would be my other sort of provoking question.
Oh, it's an excellent question. And I think at the core, we will agree on certain aspects, but let me first explain why I come to my assessment that I call it a successful model. We call it successful based on two measures. So one is simply that we try to explain economic growth. And if you look economic growth rates during the last 3 decades, the Central Eastern European region is globally among the regions with the highest rates of economic growth. So from this perspective, the last few decades were indeed quite successful. And not all of Eastern Europe, for example, has been so successful. Second, we call it successful because from our perspective, it's institutionally coherent. Everything fits into each other. So it's a very, very neat model. Everything is organized in order to please these foreign direct investments. So it has an elegance, an institutional elegance. That's why we think it has a certain attraction to us. As Germany, for example, has an institutional elegance for this kind of coordinated economy, and the US have an elegance for a liberal economy. There's always something from our perspective that we find attractive. However, we both of us agree on the point, and I mentioned this in my presentation, that it's highly unlikely that this region will ever, if it continues with this economic model, will ever be able to climb onto the same economic level, let's say, to Western Europe. That is not feasible. And you mentioned the middle income trap. I think it's a much bigger problem in this region than it is, for example, in China. China apparently at the moment is able to overcome this middle income trap, and the Eastern Asian states that are slightly different than the Chinese model because they are much more export oriented than China, which is more domestic market oriented, but that's not so important for our purposes at the moment. These economies have been able to overcome this middle income trap. From my perspective, if you stick in this region to this model, that is impossible. I mean, how can we conceive this? I mean, this is, what you need to overcome this trap is to have companies that develop fantastic products themselves and produce them and source them out and so on. And what is way more, as long as you mainly harbor the assembly platforms for foreign multinationals, you have a rising standards of living. I mean, I think many people in the regions have seen rising standards of living over the last decade, at least in the urban agglomerations. But there is a natural ceiling to that, and it will not rise much more. So if your perspective is to have, let's say, the same standards of living and the same, let's say, economic progress than, let's say, in Germany, then I completely agree with you, and it's not a success. But if you take it for itself and compare it globally, growth rates during the last decades, standards of living, then I would say it has been a success story. But as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, I'm worried about the long-term perspectives for this model. I don't really see a long-term perspective.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much for this second answer as well. Now, turning towards Professor Zoltán Gál, you used in your work, you use this concept. You quote it quite often, as I do myself. But I'm very curious about what you think about Hungary today, because we have a prime minister, Viktor Orbán, who very frequently refers to a shift away from this model. He talks even about a freedom fight against German economic colonization. And he basically claims that he has changed this model and he has a new model for Hungary. He basically talks about the emergence of a Hungarian domestic economy, a shift towards the East, so all sorts of alternatives to this model, while at the same time, if you follow the media, you find that he has signed secret agreements with the mainly German investors in the country, and he has given more tax honeymoons and more direct state support to these firms than any Hungarian government before. So there's a debate about whether Hungary under Orban has really stepped away from this model, or whether we are still in the same model. I'm curious to find out what your opinion on this is. So Zoltán, over to you for another brief presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. Actually, Andreas touched upon the point of this model, actually, that that question which was not very often raised during the last 30 years, even during the integration process, that whose interest or who is the major beneficiaries? Because all the rhetorics was in the last 30 years ago, how is it beneficial for the emerging, integrating successor countries? But it's failed to raise the issue, how beneficial is it for the West, who became the home country, the major investors in this region. So I will be touch upon this issue, and according to your recent request, I would structure my presentation on the achievement of the model. I would like to underpin your comparative idea in longer time perspective. Also, I would talk about whether is it still FDI dependent and some performance indicators. Very briefly, my research and policy alternative bits is we are in the time since the global financial crisis, which experiencing shift and challenges of this model, and political shift and also challenges and difficulties. I came to this issue actually just a few years after this article was published, sitting in ESPON meeting, European Union project meeting in Barcelona, and discussing the long-term scenarios for EU 2050 for the whole of Europe in territorial perspective, and debating with Italian and German colleagues. And the point was that all the discussion circled around only the north-south divide of Europe. And when we came to Eastern Europe, they considered, even the German colleagues and Mediterranean colleagues, Italian and Spanish, considered the whole region as a fully integrated and a kind of successful region in around 2011. So that's why I turned to actually Madison database and reading this very seminal works on dependent market economies. So you can see the GDP per capita gap between the Visegrad countries and the more underdeveloped Balkan, Southeastern European countries. And you can see that I identified three major modernization period, which mostly apply to all of the countries. But without going into details, what we can see that what the region, and particularly the Visegrad countries, the most developed part, achieved is basically the same what we had at the beginning of the 20th centuries. And the deepest point is also interesting, the transformation crisis. So in relative terms, in comparison with the 12 most developed Western European countries, the largest shock and the biggest gap was not during the wars, world wars, not during the Great Crash, not even the recent financial crisis, but during the first decade of economic transformation. If we see in absolute terms, so mind the increasing gap, the gap is in nominal terms is increasing. So it's very ambitious to fill this gap, more than a double. But if you do it like European politicians, just turning the shorter time series, and they measure the convergence of since the European integration, and you can see that every country was most progressive and catching up most rapidly during the 90s, early 2000s. But what you can see even in the richer segment is a kind of flattening down and kind of stagnating the catching up and slowing down the catching up. So particularly the turning point is the economic financial crisis. Hungary was among the least successful performer, if you can see. I mean, the middle, in the middle, not the most successful in terms of the most successful one, the Baltic states, Romania, surprisingly, Poland, and Slovakia lost the original dynamics in the early 2000s after the crisis. And despite being the most developed, Czech Republic and Slovenia stagnating. I mean, the catching up is slowed down. The framework conditions of this catching up is those kind of economic events and also political events which were much more turbulent. So the framework conditions for catching up was even more disadvantageous during the last 150 years. We can see this kind of transformation, those periods which generated the largest transformation losses in Hungary, but still this transformation crisis is the biggest gap. If you look at the absolute terms, just to focusing in Hungary, what you can see, these columns are the aggregate GDP per decades. And you can see the last 30 decades, including the last decades of the communist period, is the least successful of the least 30 years. Yesterday, when I projected in this kind of policy meeting, it was astonishing, Minister. And if you look at the gross average annual growth rates, is even this last decades, due to the 2020 COVID, is not more successful and the same level of growth produced than the previous decades. So, and we can have no time, but obviously, beginning of the 20th century and the communist period, in terms of absolute term, was relatively successful in catching up at the expenses of many other deterioration. I like this dependent market capitalism model, and I'm most, but there are other theories which are worth to mentioning. The world system models, which argues that this region was always a semi-periphery. As we could see in the previous graphs, the gap was not much difference in the gap, what Andreas said previously. So it's not much progress. And what we can see, this period probably is less progressive, this last 30 years of transition, than the previous modernization period, particularly the early 20th century one. And also, one of the reasons of this, which also important to mention, this dependent market economies model focuses on capital technology trade dependencies and very much based on this kind of investment trade nexus, and also related to the global value chain context as well. And the hierarchy and the integration of this country into this global value chain is very disadvantageous, and we are on the lower segment of this hierarchy. And also subordinated financialization and dependent financialization, which was based on, other than FDI, mostly on banking capital, became very important as well. And also one is important to mention, the geoeconomics. Because East Central Europe is always considered as a kind of buffer zone, which was also a kind of shutter belt in between the German and Russian geopolitical interest, with China rising and showing interest towards the region, and the German and previously empires and German and served as a hinterland of German economy, and recently this is also the case. Okay, so this is the model which had very important consequences, as even Andreas mentioned it. if you compare it with other models or the achievement of other emerging countries, even some of the post-communist ones like China, Vietnam mentioned, we can see and we can argue in certain extent instead of also in GDP growth and certain achievement is CE in certain performance indicator falling behind its emerging market peers. One of the reasons is not just this unequal integration into the global value chain and independent mode of integration, but also this is the paradox that the region experiencing a constant capital shortage, still reliant on foreign external dependencies, so cannot perform autonomous growth. The whole model is externally managed. So despite this shortage of capital and reliance of foreign capital, there is a tremendous outflows of resources. Not just capital outflows, but also human resources, population outflows, and also demographic shocks. Performance, whether is it still FDI dependent economy? You can see the absolute dependencies like FDI stock to GDP, and you can see originally the pioneer countries, Czechs and Hungary, still performing well. Hungary is slightly decreased, above 60% of the GDP, but Estonia, Bulgaria, the latecomers catching up in terms of this. But I think it's one indicator. But in comparison with Germany, as in and even to Austria, the FDI dependency is clearly shown in this graph. But this is an important thing. So here you can see, in comparison with other world regions, Visegrad countries. FDI to GDP ratio is the largest in the world, except some offshore financial centers, despite it slightly slowing down in the last decade. So the largest recipients of FDI, one comes to the growth. What is the impact of this huge FDI inflow on growth? You can see that among the average or poorly performing regions. So there were exceptionally 7% annual growth, but on average is just below 5%. I show the figure. It's just the average in the long term is not more than 2% growth annually if you consider. But the problem with this FDI model, why this political shift and turn took place recently, not just in Hungary, but even other countries, it's the huge fluctuation and unreliability of FDI. So in certain countries, the FDI inflows decreased rapidly, even outflows, but the underlying consequence is the profit outflows. Those countries here, you can see the net profit outflow started earlier in Hungary because it was due to this high score liberalization and earliest opening of the country. You can see here, in every country, the profit outflows indicated by green is increasing since the achievement, and it cannot be compensated by the blue, the EU funds. And also the remittances by the guest workers, which is due to the kind of outflows of human resources, refunded remittances, even cannot compensate together with EU funds with this kind of losses and other debt-related funds. Although the share within the industries, it's enormous. In case of Hungary, even since the crisis is increased, so industrial production, the foreign affiliates in Slovakia reaches 80%, but also 70% in Hungary. In export, 80% provided by multinational companies in Hungary. Although the value added is very high, but at the expenses of this, foreign value added generated by multinational companies, but the domestic value added is much less than expected at the beginning. So the supply chain is neglecting the domestic countries, and these kind of plants functioning as a kind of cathedrals of desert, not much spillover effect in terms of productivity, technology, etc., etc. You can see the German dominance. I wouldn't like to, also in the Hungarian economy is the largest FDI investors and the largest export partner as well. And what you can see coming to the end, actually, we had Visegrad countries covered database, and also recently with my colleagues, we measured the regional impact of FDI, but what we found, there is no significant impact on GDP growth, particularly not in the longer term. And what we found, domestic savings, which was a kind of key model in Asian countries, even in China. So the savings and later export based capital accumulation is the key for catching up. And even investment by governments and EU funds played larger role in GDP growth than in FDI. But the problem also, this FDI had a very strong crowding out effect, which even in the most attractive regions, most considered to be most developed regions from FDI point of view, is drying out other kind of endogenous factors, and even crowding out, like pulling out and draining out and pulling out and attracting the most skilled labor towards multinational companies. So it's a kind of struggle of the medium-sized company, particularly Mittelstand, which are shrinking in Hungary. So these are negative terms. So coming to the end, so in macroeconomic impact is very negative. So this is a kind of explanation why you cannot see a strong impact on GDP or the catching up process. It's the dual economy is one of the kind of visible effect. And also the big problem, because we had in the turn of the century, we had within the empires, we had a kind of foreign induced capitalism, like Austrian and Czech capital played an important role. But after the time being, it shifted towards a kind of internal capital accumulation. So this is one of the biggest shortcomings of this model. It's failed to generate this kind of internal processes, and failed to shift, like the Singaporean model is a good example, how an Irish model, how to shift, how to use this kind of skills experience during this FDI-led model towards investing in your domestic economies. And the policy implications. Obviously, not just Hungarian government, but other governments realized that, particularly after the crisis, which was not considered to be an external shocks in Eastern European countries, because in certain macroeconomic indicators was much more stable in the banking sector, except FX mortgages, than in other Western counterparts. But because of vulnerability due to this external dependency. So the crisis was rather shown and revealed the vulnerability of this model rather than considered to be an external shock. So these countries realized, the politicians, that something wrong with the model, and the most modest Polish National Bank written that the end date and this model should be terminated because it served its original aim and goal, but there is not more potential to further rely on this model. So countries like Hungary, due to the needs for macroeconomic stabilization and due to the debt crisis generated by this financialization, started to select or distinguish between good or bad multinationals. And bad multinationals turn to be service sector-based multinationals, banks, foreign banks, but still keeping a strong relation with FDI-related manufacturing companies. This has an obvious reason, which even Andreas mentioned. The role of the banking sector is quite controversial here. This is a more banking-based financial system, but the role of the bank is not that decisive or strong or significant from the future development potential of the country than manufacturing sector.
Okay, Zoltán, I think I will have to slowly cut you off there because we're running out of time. Would you like to finish off?
Yeah, that's right. So this is a kind of interesting to discuss further. Why is distinguishing between bad or good multinationals, but also started to find alternate policies. So national developing, nurturing national champions, multinationals. But the big problems is in the top 500 largest companies in Eastern Europe, 60% are foreign owned. But in Hungary, the situation is even worse. 80% of the 500 largest Hungarian companies are multinationals. But Hungary has few strong regional multinationals, but we have a disadvantage in comparison with Czech and Poland, which has much more bigger domestic companies.
Okay.
So these are the alternatives. Whether the kind of balance can be shifted from the multinational companies' reliance towards the domestic economic.
Okay, thank you very much, Zoltán, for this discussion.
Thanks.
I'd like to, can you take off your screen, please?
Yeah, please, yes.
Thank you. I'd just like to get a confirmation. I mean, you had this fireworks, basically, of charts and literature, but I'd just like to get confirmation from you whether I understood you correctly. So just a simple yes or no, you're not as optimistic about this model, about the past performance of this model as Andreas is. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah.
And the second thing is, in terms of the question about whether Viktor Orbán's prime ministership or term in office has moved away from this model, whether we now have a new model in Hungary, you're not optimistic about that either. What I gathered from this presentation is that you believe that we are still in this FDI-dependent model in Hungary today, after 10 years or 11 years of Viktor Orbán.
There are two reasons, at least, actually. Even the government realized this, so still keeping very strong collaboration with multinational companies, particularly German companies. And just you can see that Hungary is the largest subsidizers of multinational companies, and 35% are received by German companies. And this subsidizing is over 1,300 billion euros. So each year, the government spend roughly around 100 billion, which is almost equal with the spend on public works or something like that. And so these decades, the last decades, the subsidies doubled or even more than doubled. So this is one thing, because what we can see.
What's the other thing, Zoltán? You need to keep it short. What's the other thing?
Other things is finding alternate investors. But the problem with the alternate investors are also creates a dependent market situation, whether it's Chinese or any kind of other investors.
Okay, we get it. Okay, thank you very much for that. Can we go back to Andreas, please? So you saw Zoltán's presentation. Before we move over to questions from the audience, and we're already getting some questions in the chat box, and I encourage everybody in the audience to either write us questions in the chat box or raise your hand if you want to ask a question a little bit later. But before we turn to the audience, I'd like to give the floor back to Andreas. You've seen the presentation of Zoltán. What's your impression?
Well, we largely agree. I mean, there's one point of maybe disagreement, that is the assessment of the success or not success of that model during the last decades. It depends from your vantage point. Zoltán has a much longer historical perspective on this. I've only looked at, let's say, comparable growth figures during the last decades, and I found it very successful. But otherwise, I think we agree quite on most points. I mean, starting, let's say, from the world systems perspective that Zoltán mentioned. The first draft of our article was written from a world systems perspective. So we later discarded it because reviewers told us that was too much in one article. I would also agree on the unreliability of FDI flows, as we have seen during the global financial crisis, where we have seen this, and so on. So I think we agree on the bad perspectives of the model. I think we completely agree on that. We would also agree that we didn't see a substantial change over the last 10 years. I don't think that the model has changed substantially. Maybe we disagree a bit on whether the model was really so unsuccessful in terms of raising living conditions in the region over the last 3 decades, which I see a bit more positively.
Okay, thank you very much. Understood. Now, we have some questions already in the chat box, which I'm going to read to you. And then after that, we also have some participants already raising our hands. So the next thing we'll do after that is we'll go to direct questions. But before that, a couple of questions from the chat box. Roland Gurai, how do you see the increasing role of automation, automized manufacturing on the FDI flow to the V4? That's the first question. Second one is László Árva. I think that this type of capitalism is not unique at all. In Latin America, we might find similar models. Andreas has already alluded to Mexico, but I think László believes that this is a more generalizable model to all of Latin America. So I'm interested in your opinions about whether it's similar to Latin America or not. Then there's a question about the transition plan. Okay, I think we talked about this one, the transition plan from current FDI reliant model. But if you could talk about this from Tai Duong Nguyen, what would be a model? So what would you advise would be a transition plan away from this FDI dependent model? And then László Árva again, cronyism, the issue of cronyism and the middle income trap. And then by Adrián Veres, do you think that the EU takes a unique approach to democracy? So the approach of the EU towards Hungary in terms of democracy, because it has received massive amounts of investment by German and Dutch companies. Yeah, I stopped there because I think these basically are a lot of questions already. We have 2 direct questions afterwards, so I can see László Harsányi and Christopher Hallett. I can see your hands, but let me come back to you a little bit later, because I think these questions from the chat box are already a lot for our panelists. I'd like to encourage you to keep it very short. You don't have to answer every question, just the ones that you feel are relevant to you. And I'd really, really like to encourage you to keep it short, because we have to economize with time. Professor Nölke, over to you.
Very fast. Automation, I think this is something that would rather maybe play against the region, because if we see a stronger degree of automation, we don't need this excellent, let's say, talented people in the region anymore, and Germany could have this manufacturing in Germany itself. And here you have these excellent people with low wages, which is a big advantage from the German perspective. on Latin America. Now, I work a lot on this, particularly on Brazil, and I can assure you that there is no Latin American economy that has sold out so completely as the Visegrad region. In every Latin American economy, you have certain sectors of the economy that are still dominated by domestic capitalists, and FDI plays a role, in particular in Brazil, but it only has maybe 1/3 of the economy. So it's much more limited than in Central Eastern Europe. A transition model and investors in these countries. Now, indeed, both questions are related. I think what is really important is really that you have to nurture domestic companies. That is really, really important. Domestic companies that are technologically really leading. So it doesn't make sense to have domestic companies, let's say, in the building sector or simple redistribution and so on. That doesn't really help you. What you need companies that can, let's say, be competitive on global markets in high degrees of technology. So you have to nurture these ones. And then, of course, there's an excellent comment exactly to this point that this could boost cronyism. That's a real danger. Indeed, this is always a big danger if you have a model where the state has a strong influence in the economy, picks certain companies for, let's say, support, then there's a strong danger of cronyism. And you really have to take a very close look which companies are being focused on. And as Zoltán has mentioned, I think those sectors where FDI has been driven out are not really the sectors that help you in the long run. Certain services sectors don't really help you. What has helped in the, let's say, in China or India was that they didn't have a strong, powerful political center that was alone able to pick these companies, but they had competing centers. So nobody was really able to capture the state and to impose cronyism on the state. So you had different fractions, coalitions that were fighting against each other, but they were also balancing each other. So nobody was really able to misuse the state. And I think this would be very important, that you be very careful that not one group really controls the state and then helps its friends. And the last question, let's say the next question, is whether we have taken, let's say, the approach to democracy so easy. I'm not. I think it's an excellent question. I think the German companies are also torn apart because if you ask them in Germany, they say, "Oh, this is so bad. What is happening to democracy in Hungary?" But probably if you ask them in Hungary, they will keep quiet on this. I don't think that is the main reason. I think it's very difficult for the European Union to really enforce democracy in its member states. It simply doesn't have the measures for this. But this is maybe a different topic than the one we are discussing tonight. And now, what is the reason for the uniqueness and exceptions? Let me repeat this. It was also a historic situation. It's not only the European Union. It was really a situation where you had people with a very high level of qualification after, let's say, in the Eastern Bloc, and yet they were very open to foreign capital and to capitalism. And normally, people would always have reservations to foreign capital, but in this case, they didn't, and it was perfectly attractive for foreign multinationals because they had people that were very well trained in the region, but at rather low wages. So this is for me the reason why this region is so exceptional in world history and also, let's say, in a global perspective.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Over to you, Zoltán. Keep it short, please. You are muted. You need to unmute yourself, Zoltán.
Perfect. I fully agree in terms of Latin America, and just additionally, there was no communism there, so not kind of short period of transformation didn't take place. Only commonality, what I came to my mind, that Geoffrey Sachs' instant capitalism model was brought the recipe to Eastern Europe from Latin America, but it didn't work. The problem is chronism and developmental states. That's a kind of aspiration of these countries, in particular the Orban government, to develop the developmental states. But it's a big constraint is lack of investment in education or lower in and innovation. It's totally against the original essence of this model. And also the other things, what you said, that it's very hard to give a chance for domestic companies in the key critical knowledge intensive sectors, because are all occupied by multinational companies. So it's very difficult to nurture a kind of domestic capitalist class in the non-traded sector. Automatization, it's a kind of positive things, but it's a danger as well. Hungary is not a very progressive, not the leading country in digitalization. And this would COVID positive effect might be neglected due to the fact that robots can replace cheap labor. And there is no reason to use Eastern Europe as intensively. And even so far is the most important problem with this relocation to Eastern Europe, the Eastern European sites that technically represent a kind of mid-tech level, so not the highest segments of the value chain. And also, what else? Dutch companies was mentioned. So the Dutch investors is high because many of the Chinese investment coming through Netherlands. So it's a kind of offshore turning point. But yeah, one more important and the last one. Exactly, it's the most important point would be to shift the subsidies towards domestic companies. There is a kind of trend because the previous 4%, instead of 4%, the Orban government spent 24% on domestic companies. But according to the Corvinus University survey, export-oriented domestic companies perform better than the majority of low-tech multinational and companies. So there is some kind of potential if they shift this kind of subsidies.
Okay, thank you very much, Zoltán. Now we go over to direct questions. I see the hand of László Harsányi, and a moment ago I also saw Christopher Hallett, and I now see Ferenc Hámori. All three of you will now get the floor. So I'd like to ask our technical staff to first give the floor to László Harsányi, please. László, your question, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So first of all, just very briefly, I would like to thank you for this panel discussion. It was a very special occasion for me as a Hungarian and a student of Goethe University. So I will have just two brief questions. One is if you could, Professor Nölke, please elaborate on the effect of the Hungarian so-called economic oligarchs taking over significant sectors of the economy, such as energy, banking, telecommunication, etc., with regard to Hungary's FDI exposure. And another one is that you also mentioned it's a stable model for the upcoming 5-10 years. And how can personal changes affect this, such as a new chancellor, for instance?
Thank you very much for your question, László. Can we now please give the floor to Christopher Hallett? Christopher, your question, please. Christopher, you might be muted. We cannot hear you. Okay, our technical staff will contact you, Christopher. For some reason, we cannot hear your question, but we will get back to you. We'll try to contact you directly. Ferenc Hámori, your question, please. Ferenc, you are muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Is it okay now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Good evening. Actually, my first question is, am I allowed to make a comment rather than a question? I can put it in a question form as well, but...
If you keep it brief, you can do either.
Okay, so I found both presentations very interesting from an academic point of view. But in my view, it's not the main question for the future for us, not the main question whether FDA is a good model. But in my mind, capitalism as a whole has failed. So we have to spend a lot of time on how to come out of this, not whether we choose FDI or another kind of capitalism. Anyhow, I think the model, as a sense, is a scientific model. The Hungarian strategy was not chosen in a conscious way to go on that way. This was the way that was maybe the only possible, or finally we got into this way. And therefore, I think it's also, full stop now. And just one other issue. In the past 200 years, to make a better relative economic position in Europe did not succeed at any country. Maybe Finland is mentioned several times, but I'm afraid this is not not an example, but the exemption. So.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ferenc, for your question. I could mention at least 6 countries in Europe to you which did converge. The entire Scandinavian region, Germany, Ireland. I think there are plenty of regions, or plenty of examples, but I don't want to take the floor away from our panelists. Christopher, can you please talk now? Maybe we can connect you now, Christopher. You are muted now? No, you're not muted.
Sure, yeah, I think I'm not muted now.
Now you're fine. We can hear you.
Great, well, thank you. Jó estét kívánok mindenkinek, and schönen guten Abend. Thank you both for the presentation. You both have made a very compelling case about Hungary's dependence on the German economy in particular, and discussed some of the policy decisions taken in Budapest that contribute to that. I wonder, are there decisions taken in Berlin, or if not, perhaps Brussels, but I'm interested in Berlin that set the political context for this. Is there a framework politically coming from Germany that makes this possible? And are there decisions that could be taken that might divert the course of events that you've described so far? And if not Berlin, then Brussels. But in particular, I'm interested in Berlin, given the discussion about the dependence on the German economy specifically. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your question, Christopher. And last but not least, Dirk Wölfer, can you please ask the question? You are muted now, Dirk. Can you unmute? Yes, now you can ask the question.
Okay. Hi there, jó estét kívánok. As we talked a lot about the German investors here in Hungary this evening, I'm representing the German-Hungarian chamber, so I'm affected. And getting back just to what Christopher just said, so about the decisions in Germany and the decisions in Budapest. So on the one hand, of course, the influence of the German government on German business decisions is not like in other countries. So the companies do investments and not the Berlin government. But my question is rather, what do you think, Mr. Nölke and Mr. Gál, what would be a realistic way to shift away from the current model we have been talking about tonight to a different model? Because if we shift subsidies away from foreign investors to domestic investors, or whatever way we choose, would that not impose a severe risk on the midterm development of these economies? So what would be a realistic way out of the current model into whatever kind of other model?
Okay, thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you very much to all 4 people having asked these excellent questions. Over to Andreas and Zoltán. Once again, I'd like to ask you to keep it short because you're still being bombarded with questions in the chat box. So I'd like to squeeze in one more round from the chat box if we can. But we can only do that if you keep your answers short in this round, please. Andreas, over to you first.
Okay, let me pick three main questions that have been articulated. First, what to make of the changes where foreign multinationals have been driven out of certain sectors in Hungary, such as telecommunications, energy, and so on. I would say that this should not be overemphasized because the sectors affected so far are not the crucial ones for the long-term development of the Hungarian economy. So I wouldn't put this as a very particularly positive development. You would rather need to go more into manufacturing, high technology sectors in order to really make a change. Second, let me move to the last question, which I find very intriguing and also the most difficult one: how to move away from this model and how to move towards a model that is more sustainable. I think Zoltán and I have already highlighted, of course, some of the measures that are necessary, but for example, investment in education, technology, research, that would be very, very important. Support companies, but only if they can prove, for example, that they can compete on world markets based on technology based exports. Otherwise, there's a danger of that the money is being lost. But you're right, this can only be managed in a very careful way, because if you, let's say, withdraw support for the existing investments too quickly, then of course you may be in a situation where you have neither, let's say, the current investments nor, let's say, the future Hungarian company. So here, this is a gradual process, but it has to be started rather sooner than later. I don't deal with, let's say, in this presentation with capitalism as a whole. This whole concept is really accepts capitalism as given, and the question is really how can we manage capitalism in different ways, in different models? What alternatives do we have? But let me come to Germany. Indeed, I would agree with the assessment that it doesn't really make such a big change who's the next chancellor in Germany. I think it makes a much more limited difference than compared to Hungary. And our chancellor doesn't pick individual companies for support and so on. What would make a change in Germany is if Germany decides to move away from the extreme export-oriented model. I mean, the German economy has moved in a direction that is extremely dependent on exports. And I think this is very dangerous for the next years, particularly if you think about the next Cold War between the US and China. I think there's a high likelihood that Germany will get into massive difficulties with its strong export focus in the next years. And what would make a difference for Hungary is if Germany moves away from this export focus and focuses more on domestic demand, higher wages domestically, higher state expenditures. This would lead to a change for Hungary. It also would, for example, give better export opportunities for Hungarian companies because there would be no domestic demand in Germany. So this could make a change. But at the moment, I think all German leading politicians agree on the export-led model, and nobody really has cast it into doubt. If they start to do so, that would affect the region quite strongly.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. Zoltán.
Thank you very much. I mean, raised a couple of times the role, the position of Germany, not just in economics, but also in political terms as well, as a kind of intervention or power. That's very interesting that Germany was an engine of European integration as a civilian power. But recently there is an accusation against Germany that moved towards to be explicitly a kind of geo-economic power, just following its economic, purely economic interest, and Germany is more like a kind of mercantilist power in this term, but lost that kind of positive role in terms of interventionist manner in integration. But okay, this is so definitely economic interest comes first, and political is lagging behind. But it has a risk, because Russia and China in front of the gate. And if Germany doesn't exercise its geopolitical role, I know that military is kind of afraid of this kind of military, using the military exercise, but this is a kind of big problem, particularly in this buffer zone, which located between Russia and Germany. So this is, I think it's a kind of relevant problem. The other problem is shift towards other model. It's impossible because this region are not able, or so far was not able to generate enough capital, and the human resource, the conditions of human resource are deteriorated in the last decades. I mean, I don't know whether you are familiar with the fact that this is the only region in the world in the last 30 years which experiencing net population loss. Because for complex region, no immigration, large out migration, large death rate, low birth rate. So it's a kind of combination of bad things. And the other things that even the available labor source is not very well trained, and the institutional framework for higher education and institutions are still showing certain kind of inferiority. The other problem is that kind of financial nationalism. It has a logic actually in this kind of shifting towards alternative model, because you cannot escape from the FDI dependent model. At least what you can do is increase your independence partially, or shifting towards other FDI investors, which is similarly kind of risky and dangerous. But this financial nationalization has a logic, as Andreas said, that a banking sector is not that important, so less risky to take over and nationalize and privatize by domestic players. But as a Spanish paper, a Spanish study argued that domestic banking capital played much more role in Spain in economic GDP growth than FDI. So probably it has a kind of similar logic. So it would be this kind of sector, which is already 60% of the Hungarian banking sector is in foreign hands, in contrast to what you used the 2007 years, when in the original paper it was close to 80% or something like that. So so it has a kind of potential to generate initial capital accumulation or contribute to this.
Okay, thank you very much, and especially thanks for keeping it brief. Last round. We have time for a very brief last round. I want to be able to answer all the questions from all the panelists, all the participants, if we can. So I'm just going to quickly read some of these questions that are still left in the chat. Many of them actually are related to issues we already talked about, but still, I would still like to have everybody's questions mentioned. Mijay Daniel, if we are still in the FDI model, how long can we stay in this model till we have time? We have to change. So basically the question is about how much have we got left? Felix Fleckenstein, can the uniqueness of the European Economic and Monetary Union explain the uniqueness and exceptionalism of the Central Eastern European FDI development model in the world? So can we explain this model with European integration? Adam Chuvar, what are the most important factors for Western corporations that encourage reshoring and nearshoring? What industries are mostly affected by this activity? And finally, Judith Ritz, institutions have been weakened as a political strategy recently in Hungary. Is it fitting the DME model, or will it create cleavages, dysfunctionalities? These were the last questions. I'm afraid we'll have to stop there because we are running out of time, but we would still like to answer these last rounds, or this last round of questions. Andreas, please.
Yes, excellent questions again. How much time do we have left? I think it's high time for Hungary to change. Zoltán mentioned already degradation of the labor force and so on. I think you really have to move to a different model. Now, there's one thing that is kind of gives you extra time, and that is the huge public funds provided by the European Union in the next years in the Next Generation EU fund. Without that, it would be very difficult, but Next Generation EU gives you a few more years. And it's very important that this money is being spent wisely. The next question, European Union, what is the role of the European Union? Now, the European Union played a role because it is very much built on economic liberalism. So this opening up of the region for foreign direct investment, of course, was 100% in line with the European Union, because the European Union is a force of economic liberalization. If you would have preferred a more protectionist policy, you would have run into conflict with the European Union. So it is, you're right with this hunch. Nearshoring, reshoring. Now, this is mainly related now to the COVID crisis, but we have just seen the thing in the Suez Channel as well. Some production facilities will be nearshored if they are particularly important for production. Some companies will become a bit more careful with outshoring to Eastern Asia. And the other thing, of course, is that, as I mentioned before, the German car producers will kind of drop parts of their combustion engine production to the region. That is my expectation, because they will focus in their German production lines on electrical cars. But since this is still a profitable business, they will probably move it to the region, which gives you a few extra years with this model. And finally, Judith, of course, has the most difficult question. Regards, Judith. These kind of issues this is very, very difficult. I think there were some irritations by Western European investors about some of the policies of, let's say, the Hungarian government. They don't care so much about these political issues, about constitutional courts and so on. But if you, for example, impose certain policies in the banking sectors with regard to loans in Swiss currency and so on, that has raised some eyebrows in Western Europe. And if you move with these kind of policies into sectors that are very crucial to Western multinationals, this may create some tensions and cleavages. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Zoltán.
How long this FDI model can last? I think it's still the question is whether the region can establish its economic independence, but in the absence of capital is impossible, as I said. The big problem why there was no much alternative to this model, and it's called that capitalism without capital, building capitalism without capitalism, because this kind of capitalist class was missing. But this was even the problem, not just related to the communism and the damage of communism, related the post-First World War and Second World War settlement, because after the post-Second World War, not just 15 million people were missing at the end of the Second World War, but mostly the capitalist class were eliminated from these regions. The aristocracy, the bourgeois, the civilian class, those who working in this commercial. So this kind of lack of urbanization, lack of bourgeoisie is also a kind of long-standing background. So it's a kind of more rural society had to be in this kind of trap of dependent market development. The question is whether this developmental state model can be established, or rather what we can see in many ways is rather like resembling crony capitalism, so rather to putting the stress on competitiveness and quality, R&D and this kind of thing. So this is, and also excluding the kind of rest of the society, and many people are emigrating. So this is also a big problem, as Judith asked, that social and institutional weakness is also a kind of negative issue. But you know, how to capture more value, this is the question. So some countries are better off in this model, if you can capture more value due to this from this value chain, so you will need upgrading. But I think it's like Ireland and even some extent Czech Republic showed you need to invest in innovation and higher education, and this would be attractive to multinational, and the kind of benefits is more, because rather the most important benefits is just the wages, because low taxation, profit outflows, high import share, but less R&D collaboration. So this could be short. And one more thing, that just a kind of anecdote. I would like what kind of influence the German economic and political player can be expected in Hungary, when there was a kind of action against to do consolidation of universities in Hungary, and even in your Sopron country, that was a kind of issue which university to close. In this informal meeting, what I heard, the Audi management will decide. So that's a kind of.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope we have answered all your questions. I did my best to channel in all the questions from the chat box. So I hope all your questions have been answered. I'd like to thank all of you for having participated in this discussion tonight, especially our two panelists, Professor Andreas Nölke from Goethe Universitat Frankfurt. Thank you very much for having elaborated your work and your thesis. I think our hope that we have contributed towards the wider usage of this terminology. So I hope that Hungarian public discussions will no longer be focused on this very naive and simple dichotomy of capitalism versus communism as they have been in the past. And I hope that terms such as FDI-dependent capitalism will be more in usage and other varieties of capitalism as well. So thank you very much for this contribution.
Thank you.
And also to Professor Zoltán Pogátsa, thank you very much for your input relating the experiences of the region and Hungary to the theoretical concept of the dependent market economy. I am very happy that you have both chosen to be with us tonight. Thank you once again. I would also like to thank the participants. So there was a lot of interest for this session. And a lot of people have been with us tonight asking very good questions. So I'd like to thank those of you who have been here and have contributed with your comments, observations, and questions. I'd like to especially thank the two interpreters, Daniel and Otto. You have done a fantastic job. We were sometimes speaking very fast and very sort of professional. Not you, Andreas, but probably myself. And you have done an excellent job of translating that. Thank you for the organization, Gábor Péter, Molnár János, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thank you very much for having helped organize this session. András, thank you very much for the technical support for all of us tonight. With this, I would just like to say that we will continue. There is a previous session discussion of Gábor Schering's excellent book about the Hungarian model. We will continue with similarly high-profile international authors each month in the coming months in 2021. Thank you again for everyone. Please stay healthy, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.